Well, hello, thanks for watching. I've been wanting to do some more videos, but I wasn't quite sure what to do after the Toni Morris videos. And I thought what I might do is just share some of the books that I've read that have been pretty helpful to me in exiting Jehovah's Witnesses. And so I'll just kind of go over a few of them here. I thought maybe just briefly I would touch on the stages of grief because it kind of ties in with different books help with different stages. And so the stages of grief, there's typically 5 of them talked about. And so the first one is usually denial. And that's this idea of it can't be true. And so we see that a lot. I know in my case, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance initially as the idea slowly dawns on you that maybe this isn't the true religion. And there's a lot of pushback from your own mind that no, that can't be right. After all, I've heard that this is the true religion. And so there's a lot of denial. And so researching what Jehovah's Witnesses really are can be helpful with that. The second stage of grief is anger, and I think a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses have a lot of anger and bitterness as regards being lied to and feeling like you've lost part of your life to this falsehood, and so that's a common reaction. Bargaining is a stage of grief, and so you see that a lot with physically in, mentally out witnesses where they are making this compromise of going to some meetings or being kind of in the truth and yet not, so that they don't lose things, so lose their family, their friends, their way of life, that type of thing. Depression is another stage of grief, and I think that's another one that's pretty common for ex-JWs is to feel depressed. That can go on for some time. And then the last stage is acceptance. So this is where you've kind of worked through those previous stages and are able to move on to other things with your life. So the first book I want to mention is Crisis of Conscience by Raymond Franz. It was originally published in 1983, and this is kind of the must-read book for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses that are having questions. Crisis of Conscience is really a unique book because Franz was a member of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses until he left around 1980-ish and was eventually disfellowshipped. And so because of being a member of the governing body, Ray is able to really give an unparalleled look inside the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses, how decisions are made, and things that go on behind the scenes that rank and file witnesses would never know about. And so it's really a fascinating book as you see how decisions are made that, and really the thing that comes out is that Holy Spirit is not guiding the decisions of the governing body. It's just a group of men that are seemingly trying to do their best to run things, and these decisions that may not be well thought out, or they move on to other things very quickly, and yet the decisions they make can have life-altering consequences for millions of Jehovah's Witnesses. So what he writes about seeing is very interesting in the book, but almost as important is the tone that the book is written in. Ray Franz does not at all come across as angry or bitter or resentful for how he was treated and expelled from the organization. I guess the one quality that came across to me was sadness. He's just sad that the organization does not live up to how Jesus is portrayed in the Bible, and he wishes that it were. And so towards the end of the book, Ray goes on to explore this idea of can you be a good Christian, or what would it be like to be a Christian without this big hierarchical organization with all these layers of management in between you and Jesus. For many ex-witnesses, I know for myself, it was hard to stay religious at all because we're well trained for years and years to dismantle every other religion except for Jehovah's Witnesses and to prove that they're false. And so if witnesses are proved false as well, there's really no religion left. And so many ex-JWs become agnostic or atheist. Ray Franz was not in that group. He was a Christian for his entire life, but without the need for this organized religion that witnesses and really all other religions espouse as necessary. In fact, he went on to write a second book that was published in 1992 called In Search of Christian Freedom, where he goes on to expand more on this idea of being a Christian just with you and Jesus, and that's all you need. And so that's a book I've only read part of so far, but just the part I read, it was really interesting section he has in there where he obtained some court transcripts of I think it was Hayden Covington and Fred Franz, his uncle, who went on to be the president of Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower Society. And they're on trial in the UK and talking about how it's better to have the wrong teaching but be in agreement with the leaders of the Watchtower Society, as opposed to being you yourself having the correct teaching but not being in harmony with the wrong teaching that the Watchtower is teaching. So it's really fascinating. And so again, the way he writes, a very measured, calm, loving tone, really makes this book extremely valuable if you're in that denial stage of trying to prove to yourself whether the religion is true or not. The next book to mention is The Reluctant Apostate by Lloyd Evans. Lloyd Evans, of course, the host of the very popular John Cedars YouTube channel, also started jwsurvey.org website. And so The Reluctant Apostate, published in 2017, was his first book. And it kind of weaves together two threads, one being Lloyd's own story of growing up as a witness and eventually how he left the religion. And then interspersed with that, he talks about the history of Jehovah's Witnesses and their main teachings, and really why their teachings are false when you really take an objective look at them. It's a fairly long book, as I recall, but it's not a dry book. It moves along well, and again, really dismantles the idea that Jehovah's Witnesses are the one true religion. So I definitely recommend that book. It really resonated with me because I think my story is kind of similar. We both left around the same time. We both had a similar spiritual history. We both were in foreign language congregations when we left. So I really enjoyed that book. He has since written a second book in 2018 called How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses. It's a much shorter book. I haven't read that one. I have watched his video talking about the main points in that book, and judging from that, it should be a helpful book for those who are at that point of, I believe it's false, but now what do I do? Another book along that line of believing it's false, now what do I do, is a book by Bonnie Zieman, published in 2015. It's called Exiting the JW Cult, A Healing Handbook. Bonnie Zieman she grew up as one of Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada, and she got married. She and her husband were special pioneers. They were very active up there in Canada. Eventually she left, and her husband left shortly afterwards, and she went to college, which she had sort of always wanted to do. She got her master's degree in education and ended up going on to be a therapist for many years. And then in the last few years, she's written several books both for ex-JWs as well as for therapists. She has one book specifically helping therapists understand how to help ex-JWs. But so the book Exiting the JW Cult is very nice because it kind of walks through what being a Jehovah's Witness does to you psychologically, and kind of from a therapy point of view, what the hang-ups are, and how to overcome them, how to move on with your life from that point, what strengths you have, what weaknesses you may have, and how to use those to live a fulfilled life from that point forward. So I really enjoyed that book. I've read it several times. She has a lot of little quotes from different authors and thinkers interspersed throughout the book, and I found those really helped to just kind of expand my horizons. I feel like as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, you have a very prescribed way of thinking, a very narrow viewpoint, and it's hard to even expand your thinking to see how much possibility there is that exists in the world. And so using these different quotes in the book just helps to kind of jumpstart your mind a little bit, to open it up to get more out of life. So I enjoyed that book quite a bit. She also, in 2016, wrote a book called Fading Out of the JW Cult, and that's kind of her personal memoir. She touches on her own story a little bit in the Exiting book, but in her memoir, she really goes into greater detail, and her story is very interesting, and so that was really enjoyable for me. She also has a website, and I don't know that she practices as a therapist anymore, but she has a handout on her website that you can print out to give to a therapist that you might be working with who maybe they're not super familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses, and it helps to kind of detail some of the hang-ups that you might have from being in that religion. Another book to mention is Apocalypse Delayed, The Story of Jehovah's Witnesses. It's written by James Penton, originally in 1985, and there's been several new editions since then. James Penton was an interesting fellow, or still is. He's still alive. But he also grew up as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. He was an elder in Canada, and around that same 1980 time period that Franz was exiting, James Penton also raised concerns and was eventually disfellowshipped for apostasy. But James is a PhD. He's a history professor, and so he's written this very exhaustively researched book about the history of Jehovah's Witnesses. So I know when I was in the book, I think they published in 92, the Proclaimer's book, which is sort of the witnesses' own history of their religion. This book, Apocalypse Delayed, is like that, except from a unbiased third-party point of view. So it's very objective. It is very detailed. Maybe 20% of the book is just footnotes. There's footnotes on every page, references to back up what he's writing. So it's a really well done book, and it really delves into the history right from the very beginning. Even before witnesses, Bible students were around, he talks about Isaac Newton and the apocalyptic thinking that existed for hundreds of years before Jehovah's Witnesses, And then he goes into later on not just the history but the social aspects of Jehovah's Witnesses and how it's been studied by sociologists and other scientists. So a really well done book. He has 3 books. He has that one, which is overall the history of witnesses. He has one specifically about the history of witnesses in Canada. And then he has a 3rd book about Jehovah's Witnesses in the Third Reich, specifically about their relationship with Nazi Germany. So if that historical aspect holds interest for you, I definitely recommend. That's kind of the go-to book for that. Okay, another book to mention is Combating Cult Mind Control by Steve Hassan, originally published in 1988. This is, again, kind of a go-to must-read book. Steve Hassan was a college student who got sucked into the Moonies cult and was very deeply involved with them for a while before his family was able to rescue him and pull him out. And after that experience, Steve Hassan went on to be kind of a specialist in cults and rescuing people out of cults and explaining how they work. And so this is his main book here, and it just really dissects how cults work, how they're all have things in common about how they control people, and then how to successfully get people out of cults. And he has a lot of great examples. You know, he recreates full conversations he had with cult members to kind of jumpstart their thinking and get them out of the cult. Again, not just cults in a religious sense, but just any kind of high control group, basically, that unduly controls people's lives that belong to it. So again, an excellent book. I don't know that he mentions Jehovah's Witnesses at all in the book, but as you read it, the parallels, the connections are obvious. It's along the same lines of the Going Clear documentary about Scientology. Again, a movie that doesn't mention Jehovah's Witnesses at all, I don't think, but the parallels are so clear that you can draw the conclusion that if this is a cult or a high control group, well then the witnesses also must be. Okay, another book I want to mention is called Leaving the Fold by Marlene Winell, originally published in 2006. Marlene Winell is has her PhD. She's a therapist, and she's the one that originally coined the term religious trauma syndrome, which is kind of like PTSD but caused by controlling religion. And since she coined that term some years back, that idea of religious trauma has gained a lot of traction and more attention in the psychological community over the years, which is a good thing for us as XJWs. But this book is excellent, Leaving the Fold. I haven't finished it yet. I'm still reading it. But it's kind of along the lines of Bonnie Zieman's book, Exiting the JW Cult. Instead of looking specifically at witnesses, she examines all fundamentalist groups and the common characteristics they have. So mainly fundamentalist Christian groups, although she references like Jewish and Muslim groups. But it's so interesting as she just breaks down how the fundamentalist Christian beliefs do so much damage psychologically, especially to children. Many, if you were raised in these religions, and then it kind of messes with your brain for years afterwards. One example she talks about is the idea of being saved when you die. And you would think that's a good thing, but then there's this idea of, well, am I doing enough to be saved? Am I a good enough person? And there's this uncertainty because the Bible isn't totally black and white in exactly what you need to do to be saved. And so it creates this uncertainty that I'm not good enough, or maybe I won't be saved, and really serves to drag down your self-esteem to where you have this feeling that you're never good enough, and creates this treadmill of, well, I have to do more. I have to be more good to ensure my salvation. And that really resonates with Jehovah's Witnesses, who always have this idea of reaching out and, well, can you put a few more hours in the field ministry? And again, creates this idea of, well, you're never quite good enough. You're not quite full-souled enough in your service to Jehovah. Again, it's a book, I don't think she's mentioned Jehovah's Witnesses at all specifically, but as you read it, it just is so obvious that witnesses are just one more fundamentalist Christian group that does so much damage to their members. It's a really valuable book, again, for helping overcome that denial. And not just that, but she basically lays out, I think, her therapy strategy that she uses with clients. Again, she's a therapist in California, so she takes clients there if that's something you're looking for. She also does remote counseling via Skype, that kind of thing. She also holds workshops periodically at her place there in California, where clients from all different controlling religious groups come together for a few days and have workshops to kind of debrief together. This book, Leaving the Fold, also has a extensive workbook that goes with it. And so after each chapter, there's exercises you do to, again, overcome the damage done by these types of controlling religions. So definitely would recommend that book. The final book I would mention is Forgive for Good, and it's by Fred Luskin, originally published in 2003. And so we've looked at books that address the denial aspect of grief, how to prove whether this is a false religion or not. Also talked about once you come to that conclusion, what do you do next? How do you overcome, or what's the next steps to exit Jehovah's Witnesses and then rebuild your life without that organization? One thing I was running into, though, was these feelings of anger and bitterness, just very resentful for many things. I was angry at my parents for getting roped into this religion and raising me this way. Obviously angry at Jehovah's Witnesses, the governing body, for fomenting this false religion that does so much damage. Angry at myself for not seeing through it more quickly. And so eventually, the last year or so, I've just gotten so tired of feeling these feelings of bitterness and anger. I just kind of wanted to move past that. And so this book, Forgive for Good, I found to be very helpful. Fred Luskin, he's a PhD as well. He's a professor at Stanford. And from his doctoral dissertation onward, his entire career has been focused on people with grudges, legitimate reasons to be angry and bitter at situations or people that have affected them, but looking at how to move past that, to forgive that situation so that you can kind of get on with your life. And so he has spent his whole career doing studies over the years to help to refine the process of how to forgive. And he's very specific, not to absolve the guilty party of responsibility or say, oh, it's no big deal what you did. It's not that, but it's for the victim, for them to be able to forgive so that they can get their life back and move to a more positive frame of mind and a happy life, basically. And so he breaks down how to do that, basically, how to kind of reframe your thinking and to a more positive mindset and forgive the situation. And he has many examples of people that he's met in his workshops and classes and studies of, again, legitimate grievances. One of his main studies was with families of victims from the Irish Troubles, the Catholic Protestant War that went on for many years in Ireland, and he was working with family members of people that were murdered by one side or the other in terrorist bombings and whatnot. So again, people with very legitimate reasons to be bitter that their loved ones were randomly murdered, and yet he's helped them to overcome that and forgive and be able to move on. So I've found this book very helpful so far, and I would definitely recommend it. I'm sure it's similar to thinking and working with a therapist, could probably achieve similar things, but in a book format, it's been really helpful. So those are some of the main books I've read that I've found helpful. There's a couple more that I haven't read yet, but I've heard are very beneficial. The first one is called The Gentile Times Reconsidered by Carl Olaf Johnson, published originally in 1983. And it really looks at the prophecies that Jehovah's Witnesses rely on to come to that year 1914. So the idea that Jerusalem fell in 607 BCE, there were 7 Gentile times that ended in 1914, which is the year that Jehovah's Witnesses have always pointed to for one reason or another. It's kind of changed over the years. And so Carl Johnson was an elder in Sweden, one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and again, around this 1980 time period, he found that the Bible chronology that witnesses were using really had a bunch of holes in it. He sent a long letter to the governing body, and Franz talks about this in his book. And he wasn't being critical, he was just saying, hey, I found this error that we need to correct to get us closer to the Bible truth. And the governing body dismissed that and instead disfellowshipped him from the organization. And so Carl went on to expand his letter into this book. And so if that's something that holds interest for you, is the Bible prophecy angle of whether witnesses have it right or not, that would probably be a must-read book. And I think the final book to mention is the book Leaving the Witness by Amber Scorah, published just recently here in 2019. Again, I haven't read it yet, but I heard very positive reviews about it. Her memoir of growing up a witness, moving to China to work that where the need is great under ban, and then eventually leaving the witnesses in her life since then. So a memoir that comes highly recommended. But again, those are just some of the books I've run across that are helpful. Maybe there's some that I haven't mentioned that you have found helpful. Again, I know there's many like books from the science angle, that type of thing, or just religious history, the history of religion. And I haven't read a whole lot of those, so if you have suggestions, definitely leave them below. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.